Okay. We're starting with Jehu tonight, and this is in the northern kingdom of Israel. We want to start off by looking at how Jehu kind of combines a couple of threads that we've been looking at, some things that God had foretold. So going back to 1 Kings 19, and in 1 Kings 19, let's remember, this is immediately following God's triumph over Baal on Mount Carmel. The Baal prophets have been executed following God's triumph over Baal. But Jezebel has declared that Elijah now is a marked man, and she is determined that Elijah must die because of what has happened to all the Baal prophets. So Elijah has fled, and God not only speaks to him and gives him comfort, lets him know that, Elijah is not the only one that's left, something that Elijah had claimed a couple of times. I'm the only one left that's following Jehovah. But then God also gave Elijah a threefold mission. The first thing he said, it's not in this verse, you're going to go and anoint Hazael as king over Syria. And then in verse 16 of chapter 19, he says, Jehu the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. What happens is, yes, Elijah does appoint Elisha to succeed him, but then it is Elisha who is the one who ultimately then anoints or has a role in anointing those other two. We noted briefly already from 2 Kings chapter 8, Hazael being proclaimed the next king of Syria, and even the weeping of Elisha because he knows that Hazael is going to be responsible for the destruction of so many of God's people. Well, now we're coming to Jehu. But there's also one other thing that we're looking at that's fulfilled in this. 1 Kings chapter 21, something that kind of caps off the wickedness of Ahab, and there's so much wickedness in the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. Beginning when we're introduced to them in chapter 16, and we read about how, it was a slight thing to follow in the sins of Jeroboam, but they also introduced Baal worship, and so all the immorality that would go along with that. But in chapter 21, Naboth and Jezebel conspire to have a man murdered, all for the sake of his family inheritance. The land that God had promised to his people. The land that God has said was to be passed down through the generations. And if that land were ever sold, it was not to be sold permanently, and it could always be bought back. Well, Ahab and Jezebel murder Naboth and take that land for themselves. And because of this, and there's actually a broader passage that I want to read. I kind of put just the most significant part there. When Elijah first appears to Ahab says in verse 20 of that chapter, "Have you found me, O my enemy?" And he answered, "I have found you, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord. Behold, I'll bring evil upon you, and will utterly sweep you away, and will cut off from Ahab every male, both bond and free in Israel. And I'll make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Bathsheba the son of Ahijah, because of the provocation with which you have provoked me to anger, and because you have made Israel sin. Of Jezebel also the Lord has spoken, saying, the dogs will eat Jezebel in the district of Jezreel. The one belonging to Ahab who dies in the city, the dogs will eat, and the one who dies in the field, the birds of heaven will eat." And then the text continues on to talk about how there had been no one who had sold himself to do evil like Ahab. So we have these two things, the idea that there was going to be another king anointed, and also the idea of God's declaration that Ahab and all of his house are going to be punished. Well, and those threads come together in the time of Jehu. It is Jehu who is going to be appointed by God not only to destroy Ahab, but also to wipe out Baal worship. Now, of course, by the time we get to Jehu, Ahab's already died. Ahab had died in a fight for Ramoth Gilead, and you may remember that dogs are involved there. The idea of, going to clean out the blood from the chariot, and the dogs are there lapping up the blood from the chariot. So there's some fulfillment of God's words already. But now we're going to see Jehu with a vengeance execute the Lord's decreed punishment on Ahab and all his family. So that's kind of where we are. Any questions or comments before we get into the text here? Okay. Well, we need to start off, again, we're looking at Jehu's dynasty, and now I apologize if you have the handout, that's not exactly accurate. Jehu has four descendants after him who will reign over Israel. I don't have Zechariah highlighted on the handout. That's an oversight on my part. So this is the dynasty of Jehu. It is the longest dynasty in the northern kingdom of Israel. It is almost 100 years, and so that is fairly stable. That's pretty significant. However, as we're going to note tonight, yes, there may be a succession from father to son in the kingdom of Israel, so some stability there, yet in the broader sense, Israel is not going to be doing well, and so we'll see that. All right, we're looking at God's judgment. We need to go back, actually, just up to chapter 8 and notice something that's in verses 28 and 29. When we're introduced to Jehu, he's not a part of the royal house. He's actually a warrior, a military commander. And what's going on is really this continuing saga of Aram or Syria versus Israel. And you may recall that even in the days of Ahab, there had been 3 conflicts between Syria and Israel. And in one of those conflicts, where God had given the Syrians into the Israelites' hand, Ahab spared Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, and the king of Syria promised to give back various cities that have been taken from Israel. Ramoth-Gilead, and we'll see that here on the map, Ramoth-Gilead was one of those cities. Well, they're going to continue to fight over this region. And that's what's happening. Now, Joram or Jehoram is king over Israel. His nephew, Ahaziah, is king over Judah. Well, Joram is in he is in Ramoth-Gilead. He is fighting against the Syrians, and he is wounded. And so he is transported back to Jezreel. Now, where have we already read about Jezreel tonight? It is where Jezebel is going to be killed. Why is it in Jezreel that she's going to be killed? Naboth's vineyard is there in Jezreel. So this is the very area that Joram or Jehoram, the king of Israel, is taken back to. So this conflict is going on. Well, you go into chapter 9, and while Joram is there convalescing, recovering from his wounds, his nephew, his relative, the king of Judah, Ahaziah, goes up to see him. And it's at this time that Elisha commissions a young man, a young prophet, to go and declare to Jehu, who's in Ramoth-Gilead, so we'll kind of keep track here. Jehu's over here. He's one of the commanders. And he says, the Lord anoints you as king over Israel. So there's the fulfillment of 1 Kings 19 and verse 16. Now this is something I kind of find interesting. You skip down, and not only does the prophet say to Jehu that he is now king of Israel, but he goes on and gives him this commission in verse 7. He says, "You shall strike the house of Ahab your master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel. For the house of Ahab shall perish, and I'll cut off from Ahab every male person, both bond and free, in Israel." And he goes on to talk about how, again, Ahab's house, his dynasty, is going to have the same end that Jeroboam's dynasty had, that Baasha's dynasty had. They would not endure. Okay? Well, Jehu, he's not just, it doesn't seem like he's the chief over everybody. He goes out and there's people that are questioning him. It's like, hey, that young guy who went in there and told you something and then he ran away, what's going on with that? And Jehu's kind of putting it off, saying, oh, you know how that guy is. No, come on, tell us. And so he tells them, well, I've just been anointed king over Israel. And then look what you see in verse 13. Then they hurried, and each man took his garment and placed it under him on the bare steps and blew the trumpet, saying, Jehu is king. Now Joram is the fourth ruler of the dynasty of Omri. So this is a dynasty that's been somewhat established. The first time that someone says, oh, we've got somebody else as king, everybody else at least is there. They're saying, okay, we're ready. We're ready for Jehu to be our king. And you find some cooperation, it seems, kind of throughout the story. So jumping ahead here a little bit, when Jehu does make his way over to Jezreel, and you remember that the guy who's watching out, he sends out a couple of runners. Say, hey, find out who that is that's coming. That's before they found out that Jehu drives like a college student who drives furiously. Oh yeah, we can see that. No, find out who that's coming. And each time, Jehu just says to the runner, just fall in line. In fact, one of them, he says, basically, I'm coming to execute God's vengeance here. And he says, get in line. The guy just gets in line. No problem with it. When Jezebel is going to be thrown down from the window, Jehu just looks up and says, if there's anybody up there that's with me, let's take care of this. And some of the officials say, okay, there she goes. Just toss her out. So there seems to be, in Israel anyway, some animosity toward the house of Ahab. And I personally wonder, does that go back to Naboth? That this idea of murdering a man just for the sake of his ancestral home, for his land, that was so odious to the rest of the people that maybe that engendered some very ill will toward Ahab's house. But anyway, it seems like people are really quick to just kind of step in here with Jehu. Well, what we see then, of course, Jehu does make his way over here to Jezreel. And so what we find is God's judgment executed via Jehu, first on Joram, and that again is at Jezreel. And the significant thing here is when they finally determined that it was Jehu, and again because of his driving style, no less, he drives furiously, the text says in verse 20. Joram says, okay, well, let's go. Let's go out and meet him. Joram doesn't know anything's going on now. Jehu's been fighting over at Ramoth Gilead. Maybe there's news. Maybe things aren't going well. Or maybe there's been a spectacular success. We need to go and meet him. And where is it that they meet Jehu? Naboth's vineyard. Okay? So they go and they meet him. And it's quickly apparent because they ask Jehu, how are things with you? And Jehu's response is, what peace, verse 22, so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many. And of course, Joram knows that this is not going well for him. He tries to flee. Jehu is able to strike him with an arrow. And it's even significant, we read in verse 25, Jehu knew the significance of where they were. How did he know? Anybody read that part? How did he know the significance of this being Naboth's vineyard? He said, we were riding behind Ahab. We were riding behind him. And we heard the Lord's oracle against Ahab about the blood of Naboth and the blood, or how Ahab was going to be held responsible for the blood of Naboth. So Jehu knew this. And so the fulfillment of that at Naboth's vineyard. Well, of course, Jehu doesn't stop with Joram. And remember, Joram is the second son of Ahab to rule over Israel. Ahaziah is ruling in Judah. Ahaziah had been there. Ahaziah tries to flee. He tries to make his way toward Megiddo, a very central, important place where a bunch of crossroads came in. He tries to make it there, but he's slain there. His next he turns his attention next to Jezebel. So let's go to that part of the passage. Some interesting things here that I tried to share with you in the notes, verse 30 of chapter 9. So when Jehu came to Jezreel, Jezebel heard about it, and she painted her eyes and adorned her head and looked out the window. And what I tried to point out in the text is that this is also, could be anyway, related to some of the idolatrous practices that Jezebel and Ahab had engaged in. That within the Sidonian, myths and some of their even depictions, and there are, I should have copied and pasted that one, depictions of Ashtart, one of the goddesses, with her hair done and her makeup on and her face in the window, and it's as if Jezebel is reenacting the part of the goddess here. So she's kind of clinging on to this idolatry, to this heathenism all the way to the end. And not only that, but Jehu comes up, and what does she have to say to Jehu? Who does she call him? Zimri. Okay, now those of you who have really paid attention in this class, who was Zimri? If you forgot about him, there's good reason why. Yeah, he reigned for 7 days. Okay, he is the one that when, when Elah was, Zimri killed Elah, ending the dynasty of Baasha. Zimri, and then Omri, declares himself king and comes against Zimri, and Zimri burns the house down on himself. Okay, well, Jezebel is saying, what you're trying to do, it's not going to last. You're not going to be successful. You're not going to establish a throne. So she says, is it well, Zimri, your master's murderer? And that's when Jehu says to those who are in the upper floors with her, if there's anybody there with me, throw her down, and some of the officials do. And then exactly what God had declared would happen to Jezebel and the dogs even eating her body, that he had declared would happen in 1 Kings chapter 21 comes to pass here in 2 Kings chapter 9. All right, so we're about halfway through the blood and guts. Any questions? Okay. I don't know if they teach this story in the kids' classes or not, I'll ask Jana. Maybe she would volunteer to do that one. Okay. Well, not done though. I'm gonna skip over to something that you read just a little bit later. It's actually the last part of this. Says, as 70 of Ahab's sons, 70 sons who are being reared and trained and guarded over in the capital city of Samaria, that the leaders of Samaria decide, you know what, better for us to align ourselves with Jehu. So again, they're not willing to fight for Ahab's line. They're willing to follow along and go along with Jehu here. And so they actually execute those 70 sons. But note what Jehu says in verse 10. He says this to really all the people, and he talks about how he had killed Ahab's son, but they had killed these others. And he says in verse 10, know then that there shall fall to the earth nothing of the word of the Lord which the Lord spoke concerning concerning the house of Ahab, for the Lord has done what he spoke through his servant Elijah. So at least in this matter, Jehu is very zealous to do the will of God. In this matter. We'll see that's not really true in other matters. But in this matter, when it comes to exacting God's vengeance and God's justice on the family of Ahab, Jehu says, we're going to do everything. And so it even sums it up in verse 11. Jehu killed all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, and all of his great men and his acquaintances and his priests, until he left him without a survivor. Now, what's the importance of that verse? What does it show us as far as what Jehu has done here. We're certainly seeing the family of Ahab is receiving punishment, but who else? Anyone who would have professed any loyalty to Ahab. That's who Jehu is coming after. And so this is a complete regime change. That's kind of a term that's been bandied about in the news a little bit this week. Well, this is not partial, this is complete. This is not just the removal of the head of state, this is the removal of the entire government. Every one of his mighty men, everyone who would profess allegiance to Ahab, they are done away with. So it's not just the blood family of Ahab. Well, you continue on. Just so happens, remember Ahaziah is the king of Judah, not the king of Israel. Ahaziah was killed after the king of Israel, also a descendant of Ahab. And some of his relatives happen to be coming up. They haven't heard about what's going on, and so they also perish. And also remember, there are other descendants of Ahaziah still in Judah. We kind of covered this already briefly, though. What happened to them? When Ahaziah died, who took power? Athaliah, and she is Ahab's daughter, okay? And then what did she do to all of the heirs? Killed them all except for one is saved, and we're going to talk about him, Joash, on Sunday. Well, so Athaliah, really, of the house of Ahab is all that remains. And we'll talk about her demise on Sunday. Okay? So this is how thorough this purge and this cleanse is, and God exacting his judgment on Ahab's house. All right? You go further, there's more family in Samaria. Verse 15 is where you're introduced to this interesting character, a man, the son of Rechab, Jehonadab. And I made mention, he is one that figures significantly in a prophetic text in Jeremiah chapter 35. You have questions about Jehonadab. I think the Foxes have some really interesting information about him they'd be more than willing to share. Inside joke there. Anyway, but again, and Jehonadab is kind of this figure who's very zealous for God, zealous for the ways of God, it seems to be anyway. And so once again, Jehu comes up to another person, another Israelite, and says, "Is your heart with my heart?" In other words, are you with me? John just says, "I'm with you." So no allegiance to Ahab, very willing to go along with Jehu, and Jehonadab will be there not only as Ahab's, the rest of his family in Samaria are killed, but also as the Baal worshipers. And that's how chapter 10 and God's judgment on Ahab and Baal come to an end. And in this case, Jehu summons all the worshipers of Baal and says, "I am going to worship Baal even more zealously than Ahab did." And make sure, he says, make sure there are no worshipers of Jehovah here, only worshipers of Baal. And then instructs his men to slay them all. And in fact, it says quite matter-of-factly in verse 28, "Thus Jehu eradicated Baal out of Israel." Remember, in these stories, we are looking at the movements of men and the actions of men. But just as in that account on Mount Carmel between Elijah and the Baal prophets wasn't just about men, it was about God versus Baal. That's what's going on here. Ahab and Jezebel had been the champion of Baal in the national religion of Israel. And God has just eradicated Baal and his champions out of the life of Israel. So this is again a text to show God's sovereignty, God's superiority, God's greatness as opposed to Baal and those who would worship and serve him. All right, yes, Ross. Right.
We're not really told that, I don't know, but it just kind of seems, like you pointed out, it's so connected.
I would not be shocked if that's not a large part of it, because to Ross's point, and Ross's point was that maybe Jehu's vengeance against Baal wasn't necessarily in devotion to Yahweh. It was because Baal was so closely tied to Ahab. And so we're getting rid of Ahab, so we've got to get rid of everything that's closely tied to Ahab. That would probably fit along with what we read about him. Because we read further, and we'll kind of go on to our next point here, we read about Jehu's failure. Because the very next verse says, "However, as for the sins of Jeroboam the son of Naboth, which he made Israel sin, from these Jehu did not depart, even the golden calves that were at Bethel and were at Dan." So Jeroboam, who in his attempt to continue to win over the allegiance of the people and not to lose them to Judah, and had instituted an apostate form of religion. Yes, probably Jehovah was still at the quote-unquote center of that, but it was a way of worshiping Jehovah that Jehovah had never sanctioned, a way of worshiping Jehovah that brought in a lot of elements, not only out of Egypt, but out of the Canaanite culture around them, things that were detestable to Jehovah, and that's how Jehu then quote-unquote serves Jehovah, not according to the way that God wants. In fact, I like how verse 31 puts it. And I'm reading from the New American Standard. I should have checked to see if others read it this way. Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord. It gives me an idea, okay, he was saying he's walking after the Lord, but he wasn't really paying attention that much to how he was doing it. And is this actually what God wanted us to do? He was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord. Now, the Lord did reward him, should we say, for his service, for his faithfulness in executing God's vengeance on Ahab. And what was Jehu's reward for that? It's the dynasty. Four descendants would rule over the throne of Israel. And again, the longest dynasty that the northern kingdom of Israel would ever know. But the only other thing that's really said about Jehu after this is there are problems in the kingdom. And guess what? Those problems are Israel is weak. Israel, because they may not be worshiping Baal anymore, but they're not truly following Jehovah. So they don't have Jehovah on their side. And not only that, think about it from a political standpoint, who Jehu doesn't have on his side. Okay? Ahab could always rely on the Phoenicians. Why could Ahab always rely on the Phoenicians? He married a Phoenician, married the daughter of the Phoenician king. Can Jehu rely on the Phoenicians? No, he killed the Phoenician king's daughter. Okay, so that tie's gone. Ahab and Judah, from the time of Jehoshaphat, have been allied, right? Can Jehu rely on Judah? Not at first, because who's reigning in Judah? Ahab's daughter, Athaliah. She takes the throne after Ahaziah is killed. Okay? And not only that, remember that passage at verse 11 of chapter 10, where Jehu not only killed all the family of Ahab, but any of his great men, any of his commanders, any of his priests who had any loyalty to Ahab. So just take all those officials out of the kingdom. They're gone. And of course, most importantly, he doesn't have the Lord on his side. So guess what we start reading? We start reading about Israel being oppressed by other powers. Now, the biblical text talks about Syria, but even before Syria, and perhaps the reason why Syria was not the problem, we had the Assyrians coming back on the scene. Remember, Assyria over the years has steadily grown in power, and there will be these times where they extend their boundaries, and then they kind of have to retreat some because something's going on closer to home. Well, when Jehu comes to power, Shalmaneser III is reigning in Assyria, and he is extending the borders of Assyria. And so this is the panel that depicts Jehu on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, Jehu bowing in submission to Shalmaneser III, and the caption reads, "The tribute of Jehu, son of Omri." Jehu is not the son of Omri, but to the Assyrians, Omri was the dynasty of Israel. So Jehu, the son of Omri, "I received from him silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase with pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, 10, a staff for a king, and javelins." Jehu has had to submit to a foreign power. Well, again, Assyria, as they have to do from time to time, they have to retreat. They don't necessarily have a setback with Israel or Syria, but things are going on back closer to home, so Shalmaneser has to go in and turn his attention there. So now guess what? The Arameans, the Syrians, they're not fighting the Assyrians anymore. So who do they turn their attention to? Oh, we're going to go back and we're going to invade Israel again. And that's what you read about in Jehu's reign. So picking up in verse 32, "In those days the Lord began to cut off portions from Israel, and Hazael defeated them throughout the territory of Israel, from the Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites and the Reubenites and the Manassites, from Eror, which is by the valley of Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan." So this whole region, going back to the days of Moses, when Israel had come up out of the wilderness, and they'd gone to the eastern side of the Jordan River, and they defeated Og and Sihon, and God had given them this land, and Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh say, "We want to settle here," and so they've been given that land and been in possession of that land throughout. Now the Syrians come and they take all of the eastern side of the Jordan River from the Israelites. All right. That is Jehu. Any questions? Yes?
So during this time, you said that Queen Ahaziah is ruling in Jerusalem, but if she's the daughter of Ahab, why does Jehu not just kill her?
Well, that is a good question. The question is, why does Jehu not go to Jerusalem? Jehu, from what we can read in the text, never really ventures out of Israelite territory. And I think he's too weak to be able to do that. Anything that comes in his territory, he does. But going to Jerusalem, I don't think he has the power. I don't think he has the ability to do so. But good question. Okay, we will get to Athaliah. Well, I think we'll get to Athaliah on Sunday. We're going to say just a couple of things here about the last Jehoahaz and Jehoash. 2 Kings chapter 13 tells us about their reign. And again, particularly in Jehoahaz's reign, things are not well. Hazael and then Hazael's son continue to invade, to afflict losses on Israel. But I tell you, the fascinating thing that you read here, because it talks about in verse 3 that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. But then in verse 4, Jehoahaz entreated the favor of the Lord, and the Lord listened to him. Talk about a God who is merciful, a God who is patient, a God who has given these kings and this people so many opportunities. And so we're in a line, an unbroken line of Israelite kings that have not turned truly to Jehovah. And now here's a king who petitions the Lord, and the Lord hears him. Interestingly, in verse 5, the Lord gave Israel a deliverer. Text doesn't say who it is. And so we are only left to to do our best educated guess. History would kind of tell us who that probably is, and it's another Assyrian king. Assyria had kind of taken care of things back home, and now they're extending their power again. And when Assyria extended their power, the first kind of stop was Aram or Syria, and so that kind of took the Syrian attention away from Israel. I tell you, we're not going to try to get the rest of this done tonight, but one of the things that kind of stuck out to me as a takeaway from all this, we sing a song, and it's based off of really a few psalms, the idea of the Lord being a shield about me, and God, promising that kind of protection for His people. That's one of the things we're seeing here in these horrific stories. What happens to God's people when they turn away from God? That shield's gone. And what happens when the shield is gone? Well, then you're just subject to the rest of the world just like everybody else. You've got no protection from the Assyrians. You've got no protection from Aram. You've got no protection from invaders from Edom or Moab or any place else. Your shield is gone. And that's what we see tragically over and over again, particularly in the northern kingdom of Israel. We see that some in the southern kingdom of Judah too. But you see that throughout Israel's history. They don't have a shield. They don't have a protector. And we see these few occasions where a king will petition God and God listens. And just think of what God could do for God, and God listens. And just think of what God could do for Israel if the king and the people with him had turned to him. All right, any other questions or comments tonight? We'll finish this part up quickly, and then we'll move on into Athaliah, and particularly really how Joash comes to the throne, and look at him Sunday. All right. Thank you, everybody. You've been very kind and attentive.